Today's story is part of our Whispers of Forgotten Women series, spotlighting timeless words from women whose voices shaped, challenged, or quietly transformed the literary landscape. This episode brings you The White Heron by Orne Jewett. First published in 1886, it holds a question still relevant today. What do we choose to protect? And what do we give up to belong? Orne Jewett, 1849 to 1909. She had a gift for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. Born in the small town of South Berwick, Maine, she grew up surrounded by quiet landscapes and close-knit communities. The kinds of places where life moves at a slower pace, but where every choice and memory carries real weight. Jewett's writing captures that world with a gentle hand and a keen eye for the small, telling details that reveal a character's heart. She didn't write about grand adventures or sweeping dramas. Instead, she wrote about life as most of us live it, full of small moments, quiet decisions, and the steady tug of loyalty, memory, and love. Her stories remind us that meaning often lies in the places and choices we might overlook. In The White Heron, we meet young Sylvia, a girl who must choose between the promise of reward and her deep love for the natural world. It's a story about innocence, connection, and the quiet bravery of staying true to what matters most. It's a piece that invites us to slow down, listen closely, and find meaning in the quiet corners of life. Let's begin. The White Heron. The woods were already filled with shadows one June evening just before 8 o'clock. Though a bright sunset still glimmered faintly among the trunks of the trees, a little girl was driving home her cow, a plodding, dilatory, provoking creature in her behavior, but a valued companion for all that. They were going away from the western light and striking deep into the dark woods. But their feet were familiar with the path, and it was no matter whether their eyes could see it or not. There was hardly a night the summer through when the old cow could be found waiting at the pasture bars. On the contrary, it was her greatest pleasure to hide herself away amongst the high huckleberry bushes. And though she wore a loud bell, she had made the discovery that if one stood perfectly still, it would not ring. So Sylvia had to hunt for her until she found her and call, "Coo, coo," with never an answering moo until her childish patience was quite spent. If the creature had not given good milk and plenty of it, the case would have seemed very different to her owners. Besides, Sylvia had all the time there was and very little use to make of it. Sometimes in pleasant weather, it was a consolidation to look upon the cow's pranks as an intelligent attempt to play hide-and-seek. And as the child had no playmate, she lent herself to this amusement with a good deal of zest. Though this chase had been so long that the wary animal herself had given an unusual signal of her whereabouts. Sylvia had only laughed when she came upon Mistress Mooley at the swamp side and urged her affectionately homeward with a twig of birch leaves. The old cow was not inclined to wander farther. She even turned in the right direction for once as they left the pasture and stepped along the road at a good pace. She was quite ready to be milked now and seldom stopped to browse. Sylvia wondered what her grandmother would say because they were so late. It was a great while since she had left home at 5:30 o'clock. But everybody knew the difficulty of making this errand a short one. Mrs. Tilly had chased the horned torment too many summer evenings herself to blame anyone else for lingering, and was only thankful as she waited that she had Sylvia nowadays to give such valuable assistance. The good woman suspected that Sylvia loitered occasionally on her own account. There never was such a child for staying out of doors since the world was made. Everybody said that it was a good change for a little maid who had tried to grow for 8 years in a crowded manufacturing town. But as for Sylvia herself, it seemed as if she had never been alive at all before she came to live at the farm. She thought often with a wistful compassion of a wretched dry geranium that belonged to a town neighbor. Afraid of folks, old Mrs. Tilly said to herself with a smile after she had made the unlikely choice of Sylvia from her daughter's house full of children and was returning to the farm. Afraid of folks, they said. I guess she won't be troubled no great with them up at the old place. When they reached the door of the lonely house and stopped to unlock it, the cat came to purr loudly and rub against them. A deserted pussy indeed, but fat with young robins. Sylvia whispered that this was a beautiful place to live in, and she would never wish to go home. The companions followed the shady wood road, the cow taking slow steps, and the child very fast ones. The cow stopped long at the brook to drink, as if the pasture were not half a swamp, and Sylvia stood still and waited, letting her bare feet cool themselves in the shoal water, while the great white moths struck softly against her. She waited on through the brook as the cow moved away, and listened to the thrushes with a heart that beat fast with pleasure. There was a stirring in a great bough overhead. They were full of little birds and beasts that seemed to be wide awake and going about their world, or else saying good night to each other in sleepy twitters. Sylvia herself felt sleepy as she walked along. However, it was not much farther to the house, and the air was so soft and sweet, and it made her feel as if she were a part of the gray shadow and moving leaves. She was just thinking about how long it seemed since she first came to the farm a year ago, and wondering if everything went on in the noisy town just the same as when she was there. The thought of the great red-faced boy who used to chase her and frighten her made her hurry along the path to escape from the shadow of the trees. Suddenly, this little woods girl is horror-stricken to hear a clear whistle not very far away. Not a bird's whistle, which would have a sort of friendliness, but a boy's whistle, determined and somewhat aggressive. Sylvia left the cow to whatever sad fate might await her and stepped discreetly aside into the bushes, but she was just too late. The enemy had discovered her and called out in a very cheerful and persuasive tone. "Hello, little girl. How far is it to the road?" And trembling, Sylvia answered almost inaudibly, "A good ways." She did not dare look boldly at the tall young man who carried a gun over his shoulder, but she came out of the bush and again followed the cow while he walked along. "I've been hunting for some birds," the stranger said kindly, "and I have lost my way and need a friend very much. Don't be afraid," he added gallantly. "Speak up and tell me, what is your name and whether you think I can spend the night at your house and go out gunning early in the morning." Sylvia was more alarmed than before. Would not her grandmother consider her much to blame? But who could have foreseen such an accident as this? It did not appear to be her fault, and she hung her head as if the stem of it were broken, but managed to answer, "Sylvie," with much more effort when her companion again asked for her name. Mrs. Tilly was standing in the doorway when the trio came into view. The cow gave a loud moo by way of explanation. "Yes, you better speak up for yourself, you old trial. Where'd she tuck herself away this time, Sylvie?" Sylvia kept an odd silence. She knew by instinct that her grandmother did not comprehend the gravity of the situation. She must be mistaking the stranger for one of the farmer lads of the region. The young man stood his gun beside the door and dropped a heavy game bag beside it. Then he bade Mrs. Tilly good evening and repeated his wayfarer's story and asked if he could have a night's lodging. "Put me anywhere you like," he said. "I must be off early in the morning before day, but I am very hungry indeed. You can give me some milk at any rate, that's plain." "Dear sakes, yes," responded the hostess, whose long, slumbering hospitality seemed to be easily awakened. "You might far better if you went out on the main road a mile or so, but you're welcome to what we've got. I'll milk right now, and you make yourself at home. You can sleep on husks or feathers," she proffered graciously. "I raise them all myself. There's good pasturing for geese just below here towards the marsh. Now step round and set a plate for the gentleman, Sylvie." And Sylvia promptly stepped. She was glad to have something to do, and she was hungry herself. It was a surprise to find so clean and comfortable a little dwelling in this New England wilderness. The young man had known the horrors of a most primitive housekeeping, and its dreary squalor of that level of society which does not rebel at the companionship of hens. This was the best thrift of an old-fashioned farmstead, though on such a small scale that it seemed like a hermitage. He listened eagerly to the old woman's quaint talk. He watched Sylvia's pale face and shining gray eyes with ever-growing enthusiasm, and insisted that this was the best supper he had eaten for a month. Then afterwards, the new-made friends sat down in the doorway together while the moon came up. Soon it would be berry-picking time, and Sylvia was great help at picking. The cow was a good milker, though a plaguey thing to keep track of. The hostess gossiped frankly, adding presently that she had buried 4 children, so that Sylvia's mother and a son, who might be dead, in California were all the children she had left. "Dan, my boy, was a great hand to go gunning," she explained sadly. "I never wanted for partridges or gray squirrels while he was to home. He's been a great wanderer, I expect, and he's no hand to write letters. There, I don't blame him. I'd have seen the world myself if it had been so I could." "Sylvia takes after him," the grandmother continued affectionately after a moment's pause. "There ain't a foot of ground she don't know her way over, and the wild creatures counts her one of themselves, and all sorts of birds. Last winter she got the jaybirds a-banging here, and I believe she'd have scanted herself of her own meals to have plenty to throw out to them if I hadn't kept watch. Anything but crows, I tell her. I'm willing to help support." Though Dan, he went and tamed one of 'em that did seem to have reasons same as folks. It was round here a good spell after he went away. Dan and his father, they didn't hitch, but he never held up his head again after Dan had dared him and gone off. The guest did not notice this hint of family sorrows in his eager interest in something else. "So Sylvie knows all about the birds, does she?" he exclaimed as he looked around at the little girl who sat very demure but increasingly sleepy in the moonlight. "I am making a collection of birds myself. I've been at it ever since I was a boy. Mrs. Tilly, there are 2 or 3 very rare ones I've been hunting for these 5 years. I mean to get 'em on my own ground if they can be found." "Do you cage them up?" asked Mrs. Tilly doubtfully in response to this enthusiastic announcement. "Oh no, they're stuffed and preserved, dozens and dozens of 'em," said the ornithologist. "And I have shot or snared every one of them myself. I caught a glimpse of a white heron 3 miles from here on Saturday, and I followed it in this direction. They had never been found in this district at all, the little white heron it is." And he turned again to look at Sylvia with the hope of discovering that the rare bird was one of her acquaintances. But Sylvia was watching a hop-toad in the narrow footpath. "You would know the heron if you saw it," the stranger continued eagerly. "A queer, tall, white bird, with soft feathers and long, thin legs. And it would have a nest, perhaps in the top of a high tree made of sticks, something like a hawk's nest." Sylvia's heart gave a wild beat. She knew that strange bird, and had once stolen softly near where it stood in some bright green swamp grass. Away over at the other side of the woods, there was an open place where the sunshine always seemed strangely yellow and hot, where tall, nodding rushes grew, and her grandmother had warned her that she might sink in the soft black mud underneath and never be heard of more. Not far beyond were the salt marshes, and beyond those was the sea, a sea which Sylvia wondered and dreamed about, but had never looked upon, though its great voice could often be heard above the noise of the woods on stormy nights. "I can't think of anything I would like so much as to find that heron's nest," the handsome stranger was saying. "I would give $10 to anybody who could show it to me," he added desperately, "and I mean to spend my whole vacation hunting for it if need be. Perhaps it was only migrating, nor had been chased out of its own region by some bird of prey." Mrs. Tilly gave an amazed attention to all this, but Sylvia still watched the toad, not divining, as she might have done at some calmer time. The creature wished to get to its hole under the doorstep and was much hindered by the unusual spectators at that hour of the evening. No amount of thought that night could decide how many wished-for treasures the $10, so lightly spoken of, could buy. The next day, the young sportsman hovered about the woods, and Sylvia kept him company, having lost her first fear of the friendly lad, who proved to be the most kind and sympathetic. He told her many things about the birds, what they knew, where they lived, and what they did with themselves. And he gave her a jackknife, which she thought as great a treasure as if she were a desert islander. All day long he did not once make her troubled or afraid, except when he brought down some unsuspecting singing creature from its bough. Sylvia would have liked him vastly better without his gun. She could not understand why he killed the very birds he seemed to like so much. But as the day waned, Sylvia still watched the young man with loving admiration. She had never seen anybody so charming and delightful. The woman's heart, asleep in the child, was vaguely thrilled by a dream of love. Some premonition of that great power stirred and swayed these young foresters who traveled the solemn woodlands with soft-footed, silent care. They pressed forward again, eagerly parting the branches, speaking to each other rarely and in whispers. The young man going first and Sylvia following, fascinated, a few steps behind with her gray eyes dark with excitement. She grieved because the longed-for White Heron was exclusive. But she did not lead the guest. She only followed. And there was no such thing as speaking first. The sound of her own unquestioned voice would have terrified her. It was hard enough to answer yes or no when there was need of that. At last, evening began to fall, and they drove the cow home together. And Sylvia smiled with pleasure when she came to the place where she'd heard the whistle and was afraid only the night before. The last mile or two of their journey was very happy, and Sylvia, the best little woods girl of all that country, was soon as happy with the stranger as if she'd known him all her short life. The woman had seen the hunter go away sorrowfully at sunset, but Sylvia had disappeared, and the grandmother had nothing to tell him. She sat at the wheel, knitting and fidgeting, fearing the child had come to harm. At last, Sylvia emerged from the shadow and stepped softly across the kitchen threshold. The young man stood in the doorway, and the grandmother pretended to be busy with her work, but watched anxiously over her spectacles. Sylvia's heart was beating fast with excitement and trouble, but she did not speak. The old woman declared Sylvia was worse than a dumb animal in the woods. She couldn't understand why the girl stayed silent when the handsome gentleman had been so kind. "He can make us rich if he chooses," said the grandmother. "He promised Sylvia $10, enough to buy her a new red cow." But Sylvia said nothing. Her heart ached with loyalty. She could have followed and served him, even loved him as a dog loves. But still, she did not speak. The old woman scolded her, and the young man went away disappointed. Were the birds better friends than the hunter might have been? Who can tell? That was The White Heron by Sarah Orne Jewett, a story of stillness, solitude, and the small, fierce choices that define us. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who understands the ache of silence and the power of saying no. This has been another episode in the Whispers of Forgotten Women series, part of True Voice Shorts, where we empower your story with voice. Until the next time, listen closely. The past is speaking.